Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Sunday lunch was never about food. It wasn't about family either. Not really, unless by family you meant obligation, performance, and subtle emotional warfare dressed up in a lace tablecloth and good china. I sat there, at the end of the table like I always did, barely balancing on a chair that always wobbled, between the window that wouldn't fully close and the radiator that hummed when the heat kicked in. Sylvia, my aunt, or as she liked to remind me, my second mother, was holding court at the head of the table, doling out compliments and corrections in equal measure, slicing into people with that flat, saccharine tone of hers. That Sunday, she was in rare form. Cousin Emily had just finished a long story about her daughter's college scholarship, something about rowing and academic excellence, and how the coach said she had incredible leadership instincts. We all smiled, nodded, sipped from mismatched wine glasses. Sylvia reached across the table to touch Emily's hand and said, "That's what happens when children are raised with structure." The implication didn't land softly. It never did. It wasn't meant to. She shifted her gaze toward me. I had just reached for the water pitcher when she tilted her head, that condescending tilt she reserved for when she was about to be particularly cruel under the guise of conversation. "Rachel," she said, as if I were a guest at her table instead of blood, "do you ever regret not having a family of your own?" She laughed a little, pretending it was an innocent curiosity, but I knew what was coming. I always knew. "I mean," she continued, "you've always been independent, haven't you?" Another laugh, a few raised eyebrows from the others. "I suppose some people are just meant to end up alone. It's who they are." Then she smiled, soft and smug, as if she were comforting me with the truth of my fate. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I didn't look at her. I just poured myself some more water, watched the slow stream fill my glass, felt the condensation gather under my fingertips, and thought, not for the first time, that my silence was the only language she never learned to understand. But here's what she didn't know. 2 days later, she would leave me a voicemail, her voice cracked with panic and fear, that same woman who controlled every room she'd ever walked into, begging me to undo something. "Whatever you did," she said, "please, undo it." And I listened to it. Twice. Once to confirm the desperation. A second time to enjoy it. But we're not there yet. First, let's talk about how a family can groom you into silence so long that when you finally speak, even in actions, not words, it echoes like a scream. That Sunday felt like 1,000 others. Roast beef. Overcooked green beans. Store-bought pie passed off as homemade. Conversation ricocheting between safe topics like vacation plans and old TV shows, then twisting, inevitably, into more invasive territory. My cousin Todd's wife was clearly on something, eyes glassy, smiling too much. His youngest son kept checking his phone under the table, and Sylvia pretended not to notice, even though she once took my phone away during dessert when I was 31. "Manners," she'd said. "You set the tone for the younger ones." That was her line, her game, control dressed up as etiquette. I don't remember exactly when she started singling me out. Maybe it was after my mother died, Sylvia's sister, and I was sent to live with her for a few months while my father processed things. Maybe it was earlier. All I know is that every significant memory of my childhood that happened under Sylvia's roof had her voice over it like a director's commentary. Sit up straight. Say thank you. Don't slouch. Smile more. No one wants a moody girl in their house. She didn't raise children, she managed them. And I wasn't hers. Which made me a threat, or at least, a flaw in the family portrait. That Sunday, I smiled through clenched teeth like I always did. I helped clear the plates. I offered to do the dishes. When Sylvia waved me off with, "No, dear, you'll only chip them again," I nodded and stepped aside. It had been that way for years, quiet humiliations, smoothed over with polite laughter, watched by a family that had long since chosen comfort over truth. But something shifted that day. Something precise. Not anger. Not even hurt. Just clarity. Like realizing the joke everyone's laughing at is about you, and you're the only one who didn't get the memo until now. I saw Sylvia clearly, not as a matriarch, not even as a villain, but as a woman who had built her entire identity on the illusion of control. And I realized, for the first time, how easy it would be to take that illusion apart, piece by piece. When the plates were cleared and the family began to drift toward the living room, Sylvia came to stand beside me. We were alone in the dining room, and she leaned in, her perfume thick with that chemical sweetness that always made my head hurt, and she whispered, "You know, Rachel, I've always tried to be patient with you. But the truth is, you don't belong here. You just orbit us. Alone, cold, unremarkable." And then she patted my arm. A pat like I was a child. A pitying gesture from a woman who'd once called my grief unproductive. I drove home in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't pour a glass of wine and curse the world. I just sat down at my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a slim, beige file folder labeled Taylor, PT Estate 2007. Inside was a paper trail that Sylvia had no idea I'd kept, documents I should have destroyed, sealed notes from attorneys, a copy of a signed codicil that had mysteriously disappeared from court records, but had, by some miracle, remained in mine. That's the thing about working with probate cases. People assume the paper dies with the dead. But I remember everything, especially when it hurts. I laid out the documents like puzzle pieces, turned on the old desk lamp, and began reading again. Names, dates, transfers, hidden amendments. A single, notarized page that contradicted everything Sylvia had claimed in the settlement. The name of a boy, now a man, who had no idea he was meant to inherit an entire estate. Paul Taylor's estate. Sylvia's first husband. The man who accidentally drowned after a weekend boat trip, leaving everything to her, or so she said. And for the first time in decades, I smiled. Not a polite, performative smile. A real one. Because the wheels had started turning. And Sylvia? She hadn't even noticed the brakes were gone. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with thunder or lightning, but rather drift in quietly, unnoticed by everyone except the one person who has spent years waiting for them, years rehearsing what they might feel like, what they might demand of you, and how you might respond when the door finally creaks open. That night, after Sylvia's final whisper, after the hollow Sunday rituals, after I had driven the 40 minutes back to my apartment in near total silence, no music, no radio, just the faint hum of the tires and the occasional flicker of headlights from the other direction, I walked straight past the kitchen, past the living room, and into my small home office. I didn't change clothes. I didn't feed the cat. I didn't even take off my shoes. I sat at the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and reached for something I hadn't looked at in over a decade, but had never truly forgotten. It was a file, beige, worn at the corners, with a yellowing post-it on the front. That had long since lost its stick. Written in fading ink, Taylor, PT Estate, 2007. You have to understand that this wasn't some casual curiosity, not a hobbyist's interest in family gossip or buried secrets. I work in probate law, have for over 15 years, and in that world, documents are sacred and records are rarely destroyed unless mandated. But some files, especially personal ones, remain not because of legality but because of instinct. And this file had stayed with me not out of nostalgia or spite, but because something about it had never quite settled in my bones. Something had always felt unfinished. Back then, in 2007, I was still learning the job, still over-preparing for every case, still arriving early and staying late, desperate not to make a mistake. My supervisor had assigned me the Taylor case because of the family connection, assuming that would make things smoother. Paul Taylor, Sylvia's first husband, had died in what was deemed an accidental drowning off the Gulf Coast of Florida. A boating incident, they said. No foul play. But Paul had been smart. Methodical. He'd updated his will just 6 months before his death, which was unusual in itself, and even more unusual was the private codicil he'd filed separately, an amendment that directed a substantial portion of his estate. We're talking real property. Liquid assets and a sizable trust, to someone no one in the family had ever mentioned. The name was Miles Carter, born 1987, Portland, Oregon. His birth certificate listed Paul Taylor as the father. His mother, a woman named Lisa Carter, had no legal or financial connection to the Taylor family, and her name had never come up in any official capacity. The codicil, signed and notarized, clearly stated that in the event of Paul's death and should Sylvia remarry or cohabitate within 3 years, a full 50% of the estate would transfer to Miles upon verification of identity and DNA. But here's where things got strange. The codicil vanished. Not in a dramatic, cloak-and-dagger kind of way, but in a quiet, administrative manner that screamed of manipulation. One day it was filed. The next it wasn't. The paper trail ended abruptly. The official copy in the county's records disappeared. And just like that, the inheritance defaulted entirely to Sylvia, who at the time had already been living with a new partner. No one questioned it. No one investigated. The firm closed the file. But I had a copy. Not the original, but a scanned version I had made as part of my due diligence. I knew I shouldn't have saved it. I knew it broke at least 3 internal policies. But I couldn't let it go. Something in me refused to let it die quietly. And now, nearly 18 years later, that same instinct stirred again. I spread the documents across my desk, arranging them by date, verifying signatures, matching the notary stamps. The codicil was valid. The birth certificate was real. The correspondence between Paul and his attorney, heavily redacted but still legible, referenced the boy in Oregon and Paul's desire to right the wrong of absence. It was all there. And Sylvia had known. She had to have known. There was no way a woman like her, who scrutinized every dollar, every word, every gesture, could overlook a change that significant. She had either buried it herself or had someone else do it for her. What struck me most, though, was a letter one I had forgotten was in the file, dated 3 weeks before Paul's death. It was handwritten, shaky in places, but unmistakably his. In it, he wrote, "If something happens to me, don't let Miles be erased. He didn't ask to be born. And he doesn't deserve silence." That sentence sat in my stomach like a stone. Because that's what Sylvia did, she erased people. Not physically, not dramatically, but through omission. She erased you by pretending you were never there. And when people go along with it, as my family always did, as I myself had done for years, the erasure becomes real. The silence does the killing. It was nearly midnight by the time I finished rereading everything. My eyes burned, but my mind was electric. I Googled Miles Carter. There weren't many, and even fewer with ties to Oregon and the right age. But I found him. 37. Works in IT. Lives in Beaverton. Married once, divorced. No children. No criminal record. Still used a Yahoo email address. A face that resembled Paul more than I expected, especially the eyes. I sat there, staring at his profile, thinking not about justice, not even about money. I thought about the expression Sylvia had worn as she leaned in and whispered that I didn't belong. I thought about every Sunday I had sat at that table, invisible unless she needed a target. I thought about how many stories she had rewritten, how many people had nodded along to her version of the truth because it was easier than confronting her. And I realized that what I wanted more than anything wasn't revenge, not the kind that explodes. I wanted subtraction. I wanted her empire, the one built on control and omission, to slowly fall apart from the inside. I drafted a letter. Not from me. Just the documents. The codicil. The birth certificate. Paul's letter. No explanation. No commentary. I printed it all, placed it in a plain envelope, wrote M. Carter and his address in clean, blocky handwriting, and sealed it with a piece of tape. No return address. The next morning, I mailed it on my way to work. No hesitation. No second guessing. When I slid the envelope into the mailbox, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Like releasing something I'd been carrying for far too long. And for the first time in my adult life, I thought, maybe, just maybe, the silence was about to change sides. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a decision you can't take back, and it isn't peaceful. Not really, it's dense, almost physical, like walking through a fog that isn't sure if it wants to suffocate you or just keep you from seeing what's ahead. After I dropped that envelope into the mailbox, I didn't feel elated or powerful or even vindicated. I just felt heavy. The way you do when you finally say something you've rehearsed in your head for years and realize the world doesn't immediately shift to acknowledge the weight of your words. I went to work the next day and did what I always did: filed reports, reviewed documents, made polite conversation about the weather, all while a quiet electricity buzzed beneath the surface of my skin, as if my body knew before my mind that something had been set in motion and there would be no pulling it back. For 2 days, nothing happened. The sun rose, the bills arrived, my neighbor's dog barked at the mailman, and life moved forward with the same dull rhythm it always had, except I was no longer walking in time with it. I was waiting. Not for a specific moment or outcome, but for the disruption, the moment when my action, that simple act of dropping a truth-shaped bomb into someone's otherwise ordinary mailbox, would ripple outward and touch lives that had been built on lies. And then, on Wednesday evening, I got the voicemail. I remember it exactly because I was sitting on the couch, legs tucked under me, eating a microwave dinner I barely tasted, when my phone lit up with her name. Sylvia Taylor. No message preview, no second call. Just a single missed call and one voicemail, sitting there like a loaded gun in my notifications. I stared at the screen for a full minute before I played it. Her voice, normally composed, cool, syrupy in that calculated way she'd perfected over years of passive-aggressive dominance, was raw. Not hysterical, not screaming, but frayed at the edges, like someone trying to speak while holding back tears or fear or both. Rachel, I don't know what you think you found, but whatever this is, it's a mistake. It's a misunderstanding. You don't know the whole story. I need you to undo this. Please. Whatever you did, undo it. There was a pause, one that felt almost accidental, like she hadn't meant to let that much silence in, and then her voice came back, lower this time, more desperate. He's not his. He's not. You don't know what you're doing. You're going to ruin everything. Please, Rachel. And then nothing. She hung up. I listened to it again, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to hear the tremor in her voice, the unfamiliar cadence of panic in a woman who had spent her entire life sounding like she held all the cards. It was the closest thing to vulnerability I had ever heard from her, and it didn't feel like regret or sorrow. It felt like fear. Not fear of exposure, but fear of consequence, the kind of fear that only shows up when someone realizes they've lost control, and not just momentarily, but permanently. She didn't call back. Didn't follow up with a text. Just that single voicemail, left like a confession that wasn't meant to be witnessed. And that, more than anything, told me I had struck the right nerve. What's strange is that in that moment, sitting in my too quiet apartment, holding my phone like it might burn a hole through my palm, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt conflicted. Because while part of me wanted to celebrate the unraveling of a woman who had spent her life tightening ropes around everyone else's necks, another part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to maintain the peace, to absorb the insult, to walk away quietly, wanted to delete the voicemail and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But that part of me wasn't in charge anymore. I opened the file again, this time on my computer. I reread Paul's letter, his warning, his plea not to let his son be erased, and then I opened the scanned documents I had sent to Miles. I thought about the envelope, how ordinary it had looked, how impossible it would be to ignore once opened. And then I thought about Miles himself, about the fact that somewhere, right now, he was probably sitting with papers in his hands that would append everything he thought he knew about his past. And I realized something. Sylvia wasn't panicking because she was worried about a mistake. She was panicking because she knew I had found the truth. And she knew what the truth meant. It meant her story, the one she'd been telling for decades, the one she had constructed so carefully out of silence and half-truths and aggressive hospitality, was no longer the only version. Someone else had the pieces now. Someone she couldn't control. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because for the first time in a very long time, I felt awake, like really awake, every part of me alert and alive and humming with the knowledge that I had done something that mattered. Not something big in a public way, not something that would make headlines or earn applause, but something personal, intimate, surgical. I had taken something Sylvia had buried, had built a life on top of, and I had pulled it back into the light. And I wasn't finished. The next morning, I received an email from Miles. Simple, polite, cautious. Hi. I received the documents. I think you're telling the truth. I want to meet. No fanfare. No dramatics. Just those words. And I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the weight of them settle over me. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about connection. About restoration. About finally giving someone the truth that had been denied to both of us in different ways, but with the same goal, to keep us quiet, to keep us small, to keep us out of the picture. And for the first time, I started to wonder, what if this wasn't just the end of Sylvia's story? What if it was the beginning of mine? There's something deeply surreal about seeing a stranger's face and knowing, almost instinctively, that they're not a stranger at all, that their existence has lived in the margins of your life, in whispers and omissions and shadows you were told not to chase. When I stepped into that small diner off Interstate 5, with the linoleum floor warped near the coffee bar and the bell above the door still catching on the frame, I spotted him instantly. He sat in a booth near the back, facing the door, the kind of person who didn't trust his back to a room, or maybe just someone who liked to see what was coming. His face was calm, unreadable, but his hands betrayed him. They were fidgeting with a sugar packet, folding and unfolding it in quiet repetition. It was the same nervous habit I remembered Paul having at every Christmas dinner, something about those long fingers, always moving, never fully still. I slid into the booth across from him without a word at first, just nodded a hello, trying to measure his reaction. Would he be defensive, skeptical, grateful, confused? But Miles, to his credit, didn't ask the obvious questions right away. He just looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You look exactly how I imagine someone would look who sends something like that through the mail, like you've been holding onto a secret so long it turned into bone." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was painfully accurate. And then, slowly, we began to talk, the way two people do when there's no roadmap, no shared past, but every word exchanged carries the weight of something important, something irreversible. I told him about Paul, not in great detail, because I'd only known Paul the way a child knows the distant, adult figures in their family, but I told him what I remembered, how he always bought Sylvia flowers for no reason, how he made his own coffee in the mornings instead of asking someone else to do it, how he used to hum the same 4 bars of a jazz tune that nobody else could ever name. I told Miles how Paul died, what we were told, and what didn't sit right. I told him how the will came through our office, how I saw the codicil, how it vanished, how Sylvia's name remained and his disappeared. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react the way I expected. There was no outburst, no dramatic accusation. Just silence, that slow, thoughtful kind, and then a quiet, almost bewildered question. Why would she hide me? And that was when I realized the wound here wasn't just legal or financial, it was deeply human. Because Miles wasn't after money. He wasn't hungry for restitution. He was a man who had spent his life half-built, always feeling like something was missing, and now he had the answer, and it was a woman's choice to pretend he didn't exist. "She erased you," I said, not unkindly. "She did it the way she erases everything that doesn't fit the version of reality she wants to be true." He nodded slowly, not because he fully understood yet, but because something in him was beginning to uncoil, the early stages of fury not directed outward, but inward. The kind of fury that comes from realizing your entire sense of self has been manipulated by people you never met. We spent hours in that booth, long after the coffee went cold and the waitress stopped checking in. I showed him the scanned documents again, let him read Paul's letter, the one that pleaded for Miles not to be forgotten. And I could see it as he read, the way the weight of being acknowledged by someone long dead could crush and heal in equal measure. Paul hadn't been present in his life, not in any real way, but he had tried, in the end, to make something right. And now Miles had the choice to decide what came next. He asked me, very carefully, what I wanted out of this, why I had done it, what I hoped would happen. I thought about lying, about saying something noble or detached, but I didn't. I told him the truth. I did it because she made me feel like nothing for most of my life. She used to look at me like I was a stain on her tablecloth, tolerable, but embarrassing. And I realized, after all these years, the only reason she got away with it was because we all let her. So I stopped letting her. He stared at me for a long time, then said something I didn't expect. "You don't seem like someone who needs revenge." And I smiled, not because he was wrong, but because he wasn't entirely right either. "This isn't revenge," I said. "This is subtraction. I'm just taking back the power she convinced everyone she deserved." That's when I handed him the USB drive. It wasn't much to look at, a generic black stick with no label, but what it contained was everything I had ever kept. Letters, emails, the codicil, financial documents Sylvia had filed quietly in Paul's name well after his death. And one very damning scan of a note she had handwritten, an actual, physical note I had photocopied back in the day when digital backups weren't mandatory. In it, Sylvia had scrawled a message on legal pad paper. "Miles will get nothing. I don't care what Paul promised. I'll make sure this disappears." He took it in silence, turning it over once in his hand. "What do I do with this?" he asked. And I told him, simply, that depends on whether you want justice or if you want her to know that she doesn't own the story anymore. We left it at that. He promised to think about it. And as we stood outside the diner, the wind starting to rise and the sky beginning to fade into that strange, pale orange of evening, I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the family's ghost, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the extra chair at the table. I felt like someone who had finally turned the lock on a door that was never meant to stay closed. I watched Miles walk to his car, USB in hand, the weight of a lifetime settling on his shoulders, and I thought, she's going to feel this. Not today. Maybe not even tomorrow. But soon. And the best part? She won't know how much of it is him, and how much of it is me. The day the first cracks in Sylvia's world became visible to more than just me was a Wednesday, a week and a half after that last Sunday lunch, the same lunch where she delivered her usual venom wrapped in a delicate lace napkin. The same lunch where I swallowed her mockery like I'd done for decades and poured myself more water instead of rising to her bait, but this time with a plan already blooming quietly beneath my skin. I didn't learn about the crack from Sylvia herself, of course not. She would have rather chewed glass than admit to a misstep. I heard it from Emily, my cousin, who called me under the pretense of checking in, as if we'd ever had that kind of relationship. Her voice straining to sound casual while doing a terrible job hiding the fact that something had happened. Emily, who'd spent her entire life clinging to Sylvia's approval like a drowning woman gripping the edge of a lifeboat, now sounded unsure, disoriented even, as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen, a shouting match at the family accountant's office. Sylvia storming out red-faced, her scarf trailing behind her like a flag of defeat, something about disputed documents and unauthorized communications, phrases that meant little to Emily but, to me, translated instantly to "she got the letter and she knows she's not alone in this anymore." It was happening, not with fireworks or sirens, but with whispers, glances, paperwork. Sylvia's carefully engineered life, the one she'd built by editing history, rewriting truth, and erasing people who didn't serve her narrative, was beginning to come undone, and not at the edges, but right down the center. The following day, another call, this time from my Uncle George, her older brother, a man who rarely reached out to me except when he needed help deciphering medical bills or updating his living will. He was fuming, not at me directly but in general, because someone had sent him copies of financial records that suggested Sylvia had manipulated trust funds after Paul's death, reallocating money without the family's knowledge, under the guise of simplifying the estate. He didn't say thank you, of course. People like George don't say thank you when they feel their control slipping, but he did something more meaningful. He asked questions. Real ones. Hard ones. The kind of questions you don't ask unless you're starting to doubt the version of events you've believed in for too long. And once George started asking, it spread. Like smoke under a door. By the weekend, Sylvia was radioactive. Her kids, Emily and Todd, stopped answering her calls. The church group she'd chaired for 11 years asked her to take a sabbatical, pending a review of her financial oversight. Her lawyer, who'd once referred to her as a queen of organizational clarity, dropped her as a client after reviewing the claims Miles had submitted, supported by the documents I gave him, now being quietly examined by a separate probate attorney. No lawsuits yet, not officially, but the implication of one, the threat of one, lingered in the air like thunder rumbling just past the hills. And I remained silent. I didn't brag, I didn't explain, I didn't reach out to anyone. I went to work, I filed my cases, I organized my files, and I waited. Because sometimes power isn't loud. Sometimes it's the choice to say nothing when everyone expects a performance. I didn't need them to know it was me. I needed her to know. That's all. 2 weeks after that lunch, I returned to the Taylor house, not out of nostalgia, not for closure, but because some moments require your presence to truly matter. She opened the door herself, no maid, no assistant, no glass of Chardonnay in hand. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, necessarily, but the way someone looks when the scaffolding holding up their ego has been ripped away. Her makeup was perfect, as always, her blouse crisp, but her eyes were frantic, darting behind me as if expecting someone else to show up, someone who might de-escalate whatever scene she imagined was about to unfold. I didn't make her wait. I stepped forward, met her gaze, and said, simply, without anger, but with an authority she couldn't misinterpret, "You were right, Sylvia. I don't belong to this family. I never did." And then I handed her the envelope. It wasn't heavy. Just a single printed page, Paul's original will, the signed, sealed version from the state archive, not the doctored copy she'd submitted. No commentary. No annotations. Just the truth, in black and white. I didn't wait for her to open it. I turned and walked away, not fast, not slow, just steady, each step a quiet drumbeat of finality. She didn't call after me. She didn't slam the door. She stood there, holding the envelope like it might bite her. That night, Miles called. He didn't say much. Just that the first of the checks had arrived, a legal disbursement, not large enough to draw public attention, but enough to prove that the courts were recognizing him, that the wheels were turning. He asked if I wanted a percentage, jokingly at first, then a little more seriously when I stayed silent. I told him no, not because I didn't think I deserved something, but because what I wanted, I already had. I had the look on Sylvia's face burned into my memory. I had the knowledge that I had taken a woman who spent her life erasing others and shown her that she, too, could be erased, not violently, not even publicly, but quietly, thoroughly, with dignity. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had written a chapter instead of just reading one. I went to bed that night without the usual spiral of thoughts, the endless parade of what-ifs and should-haves that had kept me awake for so many years. There was still noise, family fallout, community whispers, legal tension, but none of it touched me anymore. I had done what I came to do. I didn't win. I ended something. Or maybe, more truthfully, I began something else. Because legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's what you refuse to carry forward. And I was done carrying hers.